Hello, Indian Creek 8th grade students. This is Mr. Roush. In the last section, we talked about how the United States got involved in the war and how the war ultimately ended. Today, we're going to talk about what the people of the United States did at home to help out the cause of the war and help out the troops overseas. The mobilization into war affected almost every part of American lives. After declaring war on Germany in 1917, Americans were focused on getting ready for war. So, back at home in the United States, they were mobilizing, which is the gathering of resources and preparation for war. So before they sent all their troops overseas, they had to do a lot of things at home to help support them. So we'll get into more details and how the people of the United States backed the war effort with their soldiers being overseas. To ensure the production of vital war materials, the National War Labor Board was created in April of 1918. Since the Labor Board was in a bind and really needed people to work in their factories and produce goods for the war, the workers agreed not to strike if all of their wishes were granted or their needs were met. And what they were fighting for was an 8-hour workday, equal pay for women, extra overtime pay, and the right to form unions. So all of the workers continued to work, and they agreed not to go on strike if all of those needs were met, which they were. So during the war, there was a big labor shortage with all of the men fighting overseas, so there wasn't too many people left to work in the factories. So there were a lot of job opportunities for men or for women and minorities. The African Americans started to move up north to work in the factories. There was also thousands of Mexicans that immigrated in search of jobs, and the United States was glad to take anyone because they needed people working to help support the troops overseas. So war is very expensive, and the United States had to figure out how to pay for it. This war cost the United States about $32 billion, and about $20 billion of that came from Liberty bonds, which was about 2/3 of the $32 billion. Liberty bonds was where the people in the United States could lend the government money by buying bonds, and you would be paid back in about 30 years with interest. And around that time, the interest rate was about 2.5% to 4.5%, depending on how bad the government needed the money. Not only did the United States need money for the war, but they also needed food. The United States had to provide food for themselves as well as their allies. They appointed Herbert Hoover the head of the Food Administration. And under Hoover, the farmers had to produce more, and people in the United States had to eat less. The United States had to ration their food and supplies. They had special days to go meatless, porkless, and wheatless. Some of the slogans were, "Serve just enough," and "Use all leftovers." These slogans helped remind the people in the United States to conserve food. Another thing that Herbert Hoover did under the Food Administration was to encourage people to plant victory gardens. That way, the people in the United States could eat their food that they grew themselves and allow some of the other food to go to overseas to the troops. As a result, the United States consumed less food and was able to increase the export of food to the troops. The people in the United States weren't just producing more food, but also more supplies. So that's where the War Industry Board comes in, and they supervise the nation's industrial production. They converted many factories into production of war-related goods. So if you had a factory producing anything that wasn't war-related, they would go in and turn it into war-related goods so they can help support the troops overseas. They also set the prices for consumer products. If the War Industry Board didn't want the United States to consume a certain product, they would set the price really high to limit the purchases from the United States people. The federal government also needed to mobilize public support for the war since there were still many people against the war. The Committee of Public Information was headed by George Creel, who was appointed from President Wilson, and he was an American journalist. His goal was to persuade Americans the war represented a battle for democracy and freedom. He created a number of pro-war pamphlets, books, posters, and articles. There were also a bunch of speakers that would come around, and before a movie or a play would go on, they would speak about the war and talk about all the good things that were going on. So they were just trying to build support for the war. Since the economy was booming, the United States needed workers to fill the factories, and that led a lot of African Americans to migrate north to fill those factories. This migration from 1914 to 1920 was called the Great Migration, where there was over 300,000 to 500,000 African Americans traveled north in search of jobs. They found work, but they were not always treated well by the other people. This led to race riots. Race riots are where white mobs attacked black neighborhoods and burned homes and killed residents. One of the most famous race riots happened in actually southern Illinois in East St. Louis, where there was over 100 African Americans were shot, burned, clubbed to death in the race wars. They would go in, burn their houses down, and when they'd come out, they would shoot them or club them to death. It was not a good place to be. So, even after the Americans entered the war, opposition to it remained strong. A lot of people were opposed to the war and didn't really like the United States getting involved into the war. One of the big groups that opposed the war were socialists. Socialists felt that factories and industries should be publicly owned. They felt that the war would only benefit the rich people, and that it felt that it would hurt the working class and benefit the rich. There was also the pacifists. Those are people who are against violence and against the war. The government tried to do many things to silence those against the war. They created the Espionage Act of 1917. This is where they would give stiff penalties for espionage, which is spying or aiding the enemy. They also passed another act that was even harsher, called the Sabotage and Sedation Acts. The Sabotage and Sedation Acts made it a crime to say, print, or write anything negative about the government. And sabotage is a secret action to damage the war effort. That's all we have for today. Tune into the next video, where we're going to talk about the peace conference and learn what happens to Germany. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, and have a great day.